I typically do not like to stain wood because I personally really enjoy their natural tones. But when you have a project that needs to achieve a specific look, like the C-shaped end table, well then, challenge accepted. This project is actually going to be for the wildly popular Instagrammer, Leo Maine Coon, and a few months back, I'd also made a custom corner cat scratcher for their couch. The goal with both of these projects is to get the color as close to mango wood as possible. I picked out African mahogany as a species that might hit the color profile she was looking for, and after she received the scratcher, she said it was very close, but just needed a little less red. Because she loved the scratcher, she decided to go ahead and keep it and simply wanted me to try again with this project. So what we've decided to do this time is go once more with African mahogany and test out some staining. After picking out the lumber and bringing it back home, my first step is to create the frame of the table. And fun fact, the design for this end table is actually the same design I made for my very first client. When we first started talking about this project, I'd asked if she had any kind of preferences of style so that I could start some sketches. To my surprise, she told me that she actually really liked the one I made before and wanted me to make exactly that, with one modification. Instead of a flat surface on the top, she wanted it to be like a rounded tray, similar to what I'd done with a coffee tray in the past. The reason for this is because she has a lot of pets, and that little edge will be able to help prevent things from falling off of it, at least a little. So I've just finished joining and planing all of the pieces, and I am now back on the table saw to cut them down to their final sizes. If you're familiar with my style of woodworking, I typically make cuts in stages, cutting closer and closer to their final size and never making that final cut until I absolutely need it. So compared to my other projects, this might feel a little early, but because the shape of this end table is a bit minimalistic, we were able to get to a final cut a lot faster. I then cut all the connecting angles and am now moving on to the very first glue up process. If you take a look on the screen, you can also see a track style track. The folding of these joints is gonna be a little bit delicate because there are two joints and we need them to stay straight. So what I'm doing to keep them in line is use the track to establish a straight edge and then some masking tape to keep everything in place. Then, with some good old wood glue, and for this project I'm using Type-On too, I fold everything together and smooth. While folding it up, I came up with an idea for the clamping process. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed some wax paper, put them in between the pieces, and then clamped these sides to each other. By clamping them this way, these two sides will be super even with each other, which will make the rest of the steps even easier. With the legs doing their thing, my very next step is to create the tray. For this, I'm going to be using Russian birch plywood and African mahogany veneer. Why am I using Russian birch plywood, you might ask? Well, the main reason is because of wood movement. I wanted the legs of the table to make contact with two parts, the edge of the frame and the bottom of the tray. This will give it extra stability and also look more fluid to the eye. But if I were to link all of these together as hardwood, the wood in the tray will be trapped, which is a recipe for failure in the long run. One solution to this would be to leave a gap for the wood to move around. But because this would just look silly, I opted for plywood to eliminate the movement and make the bottom flush. As you can see, I'm putting veneer on both the top and bottom of the tray, and I'm using one of my cauls to carefully slide and stick the veneer onto the wood. This process kind of reminds me of how it feels when you're trying to put one of those plastic screen things on your phone, which I must say, I'm actually really good at it, and I'm pretty sure that's where my skills of applying veneer come from. In all seriousness though, if you notice, I am putting a considerable amount of pressure and friction onto the surface of this veneer. What I'm trying to do is wake up the glue on the other side. This veneer has a 3M adhesive on the back that activates with pressure. Doing this will make a better bond, like Daniel Craig in 007. Once that was done, I went back to check on the legs and do a little bit of cleanup. Typically, I like to scrape glue an hour after a glue up, but because I chose to glue them by essentially smashing everything together, I needed to give these pieces and joints a little extra care and attention. With a metal card scraper, I scraped off the dried glue on the surface, and once I was satisfied with that, I wrapped 150 grit sandpaper onto a piece of plywood and used that to sand everything down. If you remember, I mentioned earlier that we were trying to get a color tone that was a little less red or warm. To achieve that, we're going to need to stain it. Right now, I'm cutting some pieces off of the mahogany to stain them a few different ways. Then I'm going to mail them to her so she can physically test them in her space. This sampling process will take more time, but we'll be able to make sure that the end result is exactly what she wants. For staining, I'm going to be trying out a brand new method. Odie's Oil sent me some of their staining pigments to try out on this project, which up until this point, I had no idea that they even had products for staining. Their pigments are under the name of Odysseus Cornwall and are literally in a powder form. The idea of their pigments is that you can mix and match their pigments, essentially the same way a painter would. Combine your concoction with their super duper oil and bam, you now have a stain. I do want to add that I'm not sponsored by Odie's and no money's exchanged hands. I've simply been given their product to try so that I can better understand it and what Odie's has to offer. With those stain samples sent out, I'm now back to the leg pieces and I'm currently rounding and sanding the edges to give them a smooth feel, and am also preparing to link these pieces together. Using masking tape once again, behold as I hypnotize you with my next move. Believe it or not, I wasn't just showing off my hypnotizing skills, I was also flipping it over so that I could open up the joints and start gluing these pieces together. Once I got the glue spread nicely, I folded it back up and then used a piece of plywood that I'll be using as a tray to clamp everything together accurately. I always feel a little bit conflicted whenever I remake a piece I've already made. One part of me is a little bummed that I didn't get to create something new, but the other part of me is kind of excited because not only will the process be a lot easier, I might even be making it a teeny tiny bit better. The unknowns of the first round are already mentally prepared for, and sometimes even improved upon. With the legs now curing, it's time to turn my attention back to the tray, and if you can tell, what I have in front of me is African mahogany. The plywood that I had earlier is only going to be for the bottom of the tray. What I'm doing with the mahogany is creating almost a picture frame kind of thing, except a little more snug. To make this, I first cut all the angles I need at the joints, and then, with the table saw, I made dado cut on each of the sides. I then changed the saw blade on my table saw to a flat 2 saw blade, and then made a rabbet cut on all 4 sides of the plywood piece to fit into the dado slots I created in the mahogany frame. With all of these pieces done, I proceeded with a dry fit run, and with a little bit of extra encouragement, everything fit together perfectly. I then took the plywood portion out and lined the frame up with masking tape to preserve the tightness and fit that I wanted. I gave the plywood one really nice final sand, and with all the tray's parts ready, I began my glue up. Sometimes woodworking can feel like a puzzle. The difference is that you're also the one making the pieces for it. And while that process can sometimes take a while, when you put in the time and do it well, putting it all together can be one of the most satisfying feelings in the world. Putting this tray together felt exactly like that. Nothing crazy, just some simple, easygoing, and smooth puzzle piecing. Now, remember those stain samples I sent? Well, it turns out that none of them quite hit the mark. At first, she brought up possibly just going with one of them, but I refused. If I'm gonna make something custom for someone, I want the client to love it, and if that means going through several rounds of samples to find it, I was willing to do it. So on our second round, I tried making some stronger concentrations with Odie's pigments to pull the color the opposite direction. Additionally, I decided to try one more idea. A while back, I'd purchased a big sample kit of stains from Rubio Monocoat, There were a couple of colors there that I thought might also work. So with another 2 options stained with Odie's and 2 options stained with Rubio, I packed them up and sent them over to see if any of those would hit the mark. Now that the glue has cured, it's time to work on reinforcing the joints. In a short video, I once said that wood glue can create an indestructible bond. And when I think back on it, especially in this case, I can understand why people had a problem with that wording. Simply gluing 2 pieces of wood doesn't mean there will be a strong bond. You also have to consider the direction of the wood fibers that are being glued. Miter joints are one of those cases. The way the grains are lined up doesn't produce the strongest type of joint connection. And because of that, reinforcing these joints is something I've made a habit out of doing. For this piece, I'm creating cornice blinds. While there are many other reinforcement styles, whenever I'm working with miter joints, cornice blinds are kind of my go-to answer. It's simple, it looks great, and it works great. To make the slots, I use a cornice blind jig that I made to hold the end table. Then, with a flat 2 saw blade, I run the jig through the table saw to create 2 slots at every miter joint. To make the splines, I cut off some strips from the African mahogany and used a bandsaw to cut them into the rough lengths that I needed. Then, after gluing them in and letting them settle, I used a handsaw to cut the excess off and went back to clean it all up with a chisel. After cleaning up the splines, I then worked on cleaning up the bottom of the tray with a hand planer and sander. And while I work on gluing the tray and the legs together, I wanted to tell you about a fun little story and tiny tip about splines. Back in college, I used to goof these up all the time, and it was always because I'd approach them rather mindlessly. I don't know why, but I'd always chisel towards the corner of the joint, and what would happen is that a small bit of the corner would chip off. It's honestly a duh kind of thing, but it's one of those mistakes that I found myself making too many times to be proud of. Since those times, I've adjusted my technique, so lesson learned, chisel from the joint corner, not towards it. David Hopkins from Tough Guys TV once did a short video where he had some cool music playing and stared the camera down with eye protection on. Needless to say, David's coolness factor was overwhelming, and while my cool factor isn't necessarily on that level, I do have my eye protection on, and I'm using my X-Tool laser cutting machine to create a template for the inside of this tray. But it didn't actually make it all the way through the 1/4-inch plywood. It got close, but not all the way. So what I did was flipped it over and sanded the backside until it popped right out. Once I got the template, I set it up on top of the tray and used a router to create that rounded effect. I got very close to the tray's surface, but I had to be careful not to route into it. And because of that, there was a tiny strip of mahogany left. I took care of that with a chisel, sanded the insides by hand, and afterwards gave the entire piece a round over to get the edges nice and smooth. Now in these clips, you might have noticed a gnarly bruise on my arm, and all I've got to say about the bruise is that you should have seen the other guy. Just kidding. I was in the photo shoot room trying to pull the chain to roll up the backdrop. I was in a little bit of hurry, so I yanked the chain pretty hard, which didn't roll up the paper any faster. It just bounced the entire paper roll off of the holder and it fell onto my arm. Because I bruised really easily, this one in particular turned out really nasty looking. I remember when I got it, Don was telling me that everyone's gonna think that he did it. And while there were a few comments of people wondering about it, as well as a few funny looks here and there out in public, Don's the kind of person who will kill a bug, but feel bad about killing the bug. Me? I will kill the bug with bug spray, and after it's dead, I will continue to spray it to kill it in the afterlife as well. All that's to say, if anyone's gonna bruise anyone between me and him, it'd mostly be me punching him. With all the edges and detail work done, it was now time to give this table one more final sand and to give it an extra smooth feel. I'm raising the grain with water and sanding it back down with 220 grit. On the very first end table that I'd made, I was requested to make adjustable feet for the design. When I made this one, I didn't ask if she wanted the adjustable feet or not because, well, I kind of forgot to. Instead of asking again, I decided to go ahead and just make them for this end table too. On the underside of the table, I used a drill press to make the holes for where the feet will go. And the feet, I made myself by cutting out some rough circle shapes with the bandsaw and carefully smoothing out the edges with the belt sander. Then to make it adjustable, I installed threaded inserts into the frame and the button head bolts into the feet. Right now, I am heating up the branding iron to give it a proper signature. In the beginning of my woodworking career, I would frequently forget to brand my pieces because I was always so focused on getting everything done. And starting out, I didn't have any followers or anything, so I would always think, I'm not anyone special, so why would they want one? Well, that has certainly changed these days, and don't worry, I'm starting to get into the habit of doing it. And I look at my mark as a point of pride, not only for myself, but for the client as well. And on the screen, I am preparing the stain for the piece. From the most recent sample batch, we had a winner, and it was Rubio Monocoat's pistachio color. One thing that I will always notice about a stain is its smell. If it looks good, that's one thing. But if it smells good, that automatically gives it a couple extra points in my book. In my short videos, I frequently talked about how good Odie's oil smells, but Rubio Monocoat is pretty darn good too. Is it good to be smelling them like this? I can't say for sure, but at least on their website it says they are zero volatile compounds and is safe for people and pets, so I guess my fingers are crossed. Now, it is only recommended to do one coat of Rubio Monocoat, but because I always notice that Cam from Blacktail does 2 coats of Rubio, I decided to try it out to see if it has any major difference in color and maybe hopefully add a little extra protection and longevity. Overall, I didn't notice any major difference in color, so I don't have any solid conclusions on that. In the future, I'm thinking I might do a separate test so that I can really nitpick the results and figure this out once and for all. And with the staining complete, here is the final result.